Picture this, a crowded street lit by neon lights, music spilling out of shops, advertisements flashing promises of a better life. A man walks by, his eyes caught by the glow of a luxury watch displayed behind glass. He stops, stares, and whispers under his breath, "If I could just have that, everything would feel complete." We all know that voice, don't we? That subtle whisper inside that says happiness is waiting in the next purchase, the next paycheck, the next accomplishment. It's the whisper that keeps us running, keeps us reaching, keeps us chasing. But here's the truth nobody tells us, that happiness always seems just one step ahead. We grab it, we taste it, and then, like smoke in our hands, it slips away. The car that once smelled new becomes just another vehicle in traffic. The dream job turns into long nights of stress. The perfect relationship faces arguments and misunderstandings. And suddenly, the happiness we thought we bought or earned or found begins to fade. So we chase again. Why? Because we've been trained to believe happiness is something outside of us, that it lives in objects, achievements, and circumstances. But if that were true, then the wealthiest people in the world would also be the happiest. Yet so many of them are restless, anxious, even deeply lonely. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha saw the same pattern. He described it as a fire that never dies down, a thirst that never ends. He called it tanha, craving. And he compared it to drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. Think about it. How many times have you told yourself, "If only I get this one thing, I'll be happy"? And when you finally got it, how long did that happiness last? A day? A week? Maybe a month before your mind quietly began asking for the next thing. It's not that objects or experiences are bad. They can bring joy, of course. But the danger lies in mistaking that temporary rush for true, lasting happiness. The kind that doesn't break when circumstances change. Let me tell you a story. There was once a king, a man who owned everything his eyes could see. Palaces dripping with jewels, armies at his command, banquets that lasted for days. Yet every night he tossed and turned in bed, unable to rest. Fear of losing his throne gnawed at him. The hunger for more haunted him. And even in the middle of all his treasures, he felt poor. Not far from his palace, a monk sat under a tree. His robe was patched, his food was simple, and his shelter was nothing but the open sky. Yet he slept peacefully, his breath deep, his heart steady. For he had discovered something the king had not, that true happiness comes not from possession, but from perception. This contrast, the restless king and the content monk, reveals something most of us overlook. Happiness is not about how much we gather, but about how we see what's already here. Modern science echoes this ancient wisdom. Psychologists have studied what they call the hedonic treadmill. No matter how much we achieve or acquire, we adapt. The new becomes normal, and then we want more. That treadmill keeps us moving, but never arriving. But here's the spark of hope. If the treadmill is built in the mind, then freedom is also found in the mind. The same place that makes us restless can also make us free if we learn to see differently. That's the real secret. The shift from having to seeing, from running after happiness to discovering it where we stand. And this journey, this shift in vision, doesn't begin by grabbing more. It begins by pausing, by daring to question the illusion we've been living in, the illusion that more will finally be enough. So, let's take that pause together. Let's look closer at the very thing that keeps us restless, the very engine that fuels our endless chase, the thirst that never seems to end. Because until we understand this thirst, we'll keep running in circles. But once we see it for what it is, everything begins to change. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in the middle of a desert. The sun is burning, your throat is dry, and all you can think about is water. Suddenly, in the distance, you see a shimmering pool. Your heart leaps, your pace quickens, only to find when you reach it, the water vanishes. A mirage? This is desire. It looks real. It feels urgent. And yet, no matter how many times we run toward it, it never gives us what we truly seek. The Buddha called it tanha, a thirst so deep it shapes almost every choice we make. It whispers in our ears, just one more, just a little more, just once more. And we believe it, over and over again. Think about your own life. The first time you held a smartphone, it felt magical. The world was at your fingertips. A year later, a newer model came out, and suddenly the one you had seemed slow, outdated, almost embarrassing. So, you upgraded. And for a moment, happiness returned until the cycle began again. It's not just technology, it's relationships, it's careers, it's status. We live with the illusion that the next achievement will finally silence the restlessness inside. But desire doesn't work that way. Desire doesn't end when we satisfy it. It simply transforms, shifting to the next target. The ancient texts compare it to fire. You feed it fuel, and for a second it blazes brighter. But soon, it demands more, and the more you give, the more it consumes. This endless thirst has a cost. It drains us. It keeps us running in circles like hamsters on a wheel, mistaking movement for progress. We chase after goals, but the finish line keeps moving further away. There's a story of a man who spent his life digging for treasure. Each time he struck the ground, he thought, it must be here. But when he found nothing, he moved to another spot, digging again and again. He never stayed long enough to discover that the treasure wasn't buried in the earth, it was buried in his own mind. Desire blinds us to what's already here. It makes us believe happiness is always elsewhere, in the next town, the next job, the next person, the next version of ourselves. And while we're chasing, we forget to live. Modern psychology calls this the hedonic treadmill. You get what you want, you feel joy, but soon you adapt and the joy fades. Then you run again, chasing the next hit. It's like eating sugar, sweet for a moment, but it never nourishes you. And here's the most dangerous illusion. Desire convinces us that its satisfaction will bring peace. But in reality, each fulfilled desire only strengthens the craving for more. It's like scratching an itch. The relief feels real, but the itch comes back stronger. Now, does that mean we must reject all desire? Not at all. Buddhism never says life should be stripped of joy or beauty. The problem isn't the presence of desire, it's our attachment to it. It's the belief that fulfilling it will finally complete us. Imagine desire as a visitor knocking at your door. You can greet it, you can notice it. But the trouble begins when you let it move in, take over your house, and start ordering you around. This is why mindfulness is so powerful. When we observe desire instead of obeying it, we begin to see its tricks. We notice the rush of excitement, the clinging thought, the restless pull. And in that noticing, something changes. We're no longer slaves to thirst. Think of the monk under the tree. Hunger comes, but he eats just enough. Desire for comfort arises, but he smiles at the breeze against his skin. He knows the thirst will always knock, but he doesn't confuse it with truth. He sees it as passing weather, not as who he is. Contrast that with the king, who hears the same knock and mistakes it for command. He rushes to fulfill every craving, yet finds himself emptier with each indulgence. The difference is not the world around them, it's the way they see desire. And this is where our journey turns. If happiness doesn't come from satisfying endless thirst, then where does it come from? If chasing more never works, what can free us from this cycle? The answer lies in perception, in how the mind frames reality, in learning to see not with the eyes of craving, but with the eyes of wisdom. A man wakes up in the morning, looks outside his window, and sees the rain pouring down. He groans. Another ruined day, he mutters, convinced that nothing good can happen now. Just a few houses away, another man wakes up to the same rain. He smiles, takes a deep breath, and whispers, "How refreshing, the earth is alive again." Two men, one reality, two completely different experiences. This is the power of perception. It's not the world itself that makes us happy or miserable, it's the way we see it. The Buddha once said, "With our thoughts we make the world." At first, this sounds poetic, but if we look closer, we realize it's deeply practical. Every moment, our mind is filtering, interpreting, assigning meaning. And that meaning becomes our reality. Think about it. A crowded street can be seen as chaos, frustration, and noise, or as a vibrant display of life, energy, and connection. Losing a job can be seen as a devastating failure or as the doorway to a new beginning. Even pain, when looked at differently, can be a teacher rather than just an enemy. Science supports this too. Psychologists call it cognitive framing. Change the frame and the picture changes, not because the facts have changed, but because your perspective has. In Buddhism, this is called right view, the first step of the Noble Eightfold Path. It means learning to see life clearly, not through the fog of craving, fear, or attachment, but through wisdom. Here's a story. A traveler once came across two workers laying stones on the side of the road. He asked the first, "What are you doing?" The man wiped his sweat and grumbled, "I'm laying bricks." Day after day, brick after brick. The traveler then asked the second man the same question. That man's eyes lit up. "I'm building a temple," he said, "one that will stand for generations." Both men were doing the same physical task, but their perception changed everything, their energy, their motivation, even their sense of joy. This is why some people can live in comfort yet feel restless, while others, even in hardship, radiate peace. It isn't what they have, it's how they see. Now, you might ask, if perception shapes reality, does that mean we should just think positive and everything will be fine? Not quite. This isn't about painting a fake smile over pain. It's about seeing deeply. Instead of running from suffering, we look into it and ask, what is this teaching me? Instead of clinging to joy and fear that it will vanish, we cherish it fully, knowing it too is part of life's flow. This kind of seeing transforms the heart. Gratitude arises where resentment once lived. Contentment blossoms where restlessness once grew. Remember the monk under the tree? His joy didn't come from denying the world. It came from seeing the world with clarity. A simple bowl of rice wasn't just food. To him, it was the gift of the earth, the labor of many hands, nourishment for the path. And so, even in simplicity, he felt rich. Meanwhile, the king with endless feasts saw only what he lacked. Surrounded by abundance, he still felt poor. Not because of the food, not because of the palace, but because of his perception. The mind is like a lens. If the lens is dirty, no matter how beautiful the landscape, it will appear blurred. Clean the lens, and the world shines with clarity. And here lies the heart of the teaching. We don't always control what happens around us, but we can train how we see. This is why meditation is so central in Buddhism. It's not just about sitting still. It's about polishing the lens, watching thoughts come and go without clinging to them, learning to see anger as a passing cloud instead of a storm that defines us, recognizing desire as a wave that rises and falls, not a command to obey. With practice, the mind grows steady, like a lake undisturbed by wind, and in that stillness, perception changes. We begin to notice beauty in the ordinary, strength in our struggles, peace in simply being alive. So the question isn't, what do I have? The real question is, how am I seeing? Because if happiness truly depends on perception, then changing the way we see might just change everything. Long ago, in a land of golden palaces and crowded markets, there lived a king whose riches seemed without end. His throne glittered with jewels, his banquets overflowed with food, and songs of praise followed him wherever he went. Yet when the night grew quiet and the hall emptied, the king sat alone, restless. He feared betrayal. He feared loss. He feared the day when age or sickness would strip away all that he clung to. Surrounded by treasure, his heart remained poor. Not far beyond the palace walls, under the shade of a banyan tree, sat a monk. His robe was simple, worn thin by years of use. His only possessions were a bowl, a staff, and the serenity in his breath. He ate little, slept on the earth, and walked barefoot across the land. Yet his smile was steady, and his eyes shone with a freedom the king had never known. One day, curiosity overcame the king. He disguised himself and left the palace, wandering until he found the monk beneath the tree. The king asked, "Tell me, holy man, how can you sit here with nothing and yet look so at peace? I have everything and still I cannot rest." The monk looked up, his gaze calm. "Great king," he said, "you are rich in possessions but poor in peace. I am poor in possessions but rich in freedom. Which wealth do you truly seek?" The king frowned. "But surely wealth is gold, land, armies, power. Without these, how could anyone feel secure?" The monk shook his head gently. "Gold can be stolen. Armies can be defeated. Power fades with time. These things you call wealth are like sand in your hands. The tighter you grasp, the quicker they slip away. True wealth is not what you hold, but what you no longer need. It is the heart unchained." The king was silent. For the first time, he saw that his endless striving had not brought him closer to happiness. It had carried him further away. This tale, passed down through centuries, is more than a story. It's a mirror, because in some ways we are all the king. We build our lives around possessions, achievements, and recognition, hoping they will protect us from suffering. And for a moment, they seem to work. But deep down, we know, nothing outside can ever be fully secure. And yet, within us, there is also the monk. The part of us that longs for simplicity, for peace not dependent on circumstance. The part that knows joy can be found in a quiet moment, a shared smile, a single breath. In Buddhism, this difference is described as pleasure versus sukha. Pleasure depends on conditions. It rises when things go our way and disappears when they don't. Sukha, on the other hand, is a deeper well-being, steady and enduring, born from wisdom and contentment. The king was drowning in pleasure but starving for sukha. The monk had little pleasure but an abundance of sukha. Two kinds of wealth, two very different lives. Modern life is not so different. We may not sit on golden thrones, but we surround ourselves with devices, distractions, and endless consumption. We tell ourselves, when I have enough, then I'll rest. But enough never arrives. The line keeps moving. Meanwhile, there are people with far less, those who find joy in simple meals, who laugh easily, who live without constant comparison. They remind us of the monk. They remind us that wealth is not measured in what we own, but in how lightly we can live. So the question comes to each of us, which kind of wealth are we seeking? The kind that can vanish overnight, or the kind no thief can steal? The king's story doesn't end here. Some versions say he returned to his palace, but his heart was forever changed. Others say he renounced his throne, choosing the path of the monk. Whether legend or truth, the message is the same. When we shift our idea of wealth, we shift our entire life. Because in the end, the palace and the tree are not places out there. They are states of mind within us. At any moment, we can live as the restless king or as the free monk. Have you ever noticed how quickly joy fades after getting what you thought you wanted? The promotion you worked for months to achieve, at first, it feels like victory, like proof that you've made it. But weeks later, the stress of new responsibilities weighs heavier than the pride of success. The excitement dissolves, and your mind starts whispering again, "What's next?" This is the cycle, the restless loop of desire. It begins with craving, rises into satisfaction, and then collapses into emptiness, only to start again. Like waves crashing endlessly on the shore, it never stops. The Buddha called this the wheel of becoming. Desire gives birth to grasping, grasping gives birth to suffering, and suffering fuels new desire. Round and round it turns, lifetime after lifetime, day after day. In modern psychology, it's described as the hedonic treadmill. Imagine running on a treadmill that speeds up every time you reach a milestone. You're sweating, panting, pushing harder, but no matter how fast you run, the finish line never comes closer. That's life on the treadmill of desire, constant motion, no arrival. There's a story of a merchant who spent his life chasing wealth. Every time his ships returned to port, heavy with goods, he would celebrate. But the joy was short-lived, for soon his mind raced with thoughts of bigger ships, wider markets, greater profits. Even when his coffers overflowed, he couldn't stop. When illness finally struck him, he cried out, "All my life I have gained, yet I feel I have lost everything." His tragedy is ours. For no matter how much we gather, the cycle ensures it is never enough. Why is this so? Because desire feeds on impermanence. Every possession, every achievement, every pleasure is temporary. The new car grows old. The fresh romance meets conflict. The thrill of success fades into routine. Impermanence is not the problem, it's the nature of life. The problem is our refusal to accept it. We cling as if holding tightly could stop the river from flowing. But clinging is like trying to hold water in your fist. The harder you grip, the faster it slips away. And in that struggle, suffering is born. Here lies the danger. Desire convinces us that just a little more will finally end the chase. But more is a mirage. You reach for it and it dissolves. You run toward it and the horizon moves further away. So, how do we break free? Not by rejecting life, not by denying joy, but by seeing clearly, by understanding the cycle instead of being trapped in it. The Buddha compared desire to a flame. You don't extinguish fire by feeding it. You extinguish it by letting the fuel go. In the same way, peace doesn't come from satisfying every craving, but from loosening our grip on them. This doesn't mean we stop dreaming or stop enjoying life. It means we stop placing our happiness on conditions that cannot last. We learn to enjoy without clinging, to love without grasping, to work without being consumed. Imagine two travelers arriving at a mountain lake. One scoops the water desperately, terrified it will disappear. The other kneels, drinks slowly, and smiles at its freshness, knowing the lake will remain. Which traveler enjoys more? Breaking the cycle is not about having less, it's about needing less. It's about shifting from hunger to gratitude, from restless chasing to calm seeing. And here's the paradox. When we no longer cling to more, we begin to notice the richness of enough. The meal in front of us tastes better. The company of a friend feels deeper. Even silence becomes sweet. This shift is not abstract, it's practical. Each time a craving arises, we can pause and ask, will this truly bring peace, or is it another turn of the wheel? That pause is the first step toward freedom. Because once we see the cycle, we no longer have to be trapped inside it. And when the chasing quiets, something else begins to appear, an art, a practice. a way of seeing so clearly that happiness no longer depends on getting more. If the cycle of desire is a wheel that spins endlessly, what does it take to step off? Not force, not escape, but clarity. Clarity is the lamp that lights a darkened room. It doesn't remove the furniture, it reveals it. When the light is on, you don't stumble over chairs or knock into walls. In the same way, mindfulness doesn't erase the challenges of life. It simply allows us to see them for what they are, without confusion, without illusion. The Buddha often compared the untrained mind to a monkey, leaping from branch to branch, restless, never still. One moment it clings to joy, the next it recoils from pain. And in that constant swinging, we lose our ground. But mindfulness is the tether that gently brings the monkey back, not by force, but by awareness. Imagine you are holding a glass of muddy water. If you keep shaking it, the mud swirls, clouding everything. But if you set it down and let it rest, the dirt settles and the water clears. Mindfulness is that resting. It is the stillness that allows reality to reveal itself. A young monk once asked his teacher, "Master, how do I find peace in this restless world?" The teacher handed him a bowl of water and said, "Stir it." The monk stirred and the water grew cloudy. "Now wait," the teacher said. As they both sat in silence, the dirt sank to the bottom. The surface became clear. Smiling, the teacher whispered, "Peace is not something you find. It is something that appears when you stop stirring." This is the art of seeing clearly. It's not about chasing more knowledge, more success, more things to control. It's about slowing down enough to truly notice. But what does mindfulness look like in daily life? It's not limited to sitting cross-legged on a cushion. It can be as simple as tasting your food instead of rushing through it, noticing the rise and fall of your breath as you wait in traffic, or listening fully when a friend speaks instead of preparing your reply. Each moment of awareness breaks the trance of automatic living. Suddenly, life is no longer a blur. It becomes vivid, alive. The morning breeze on your skin, the laughter of a child, even the silence between words, all shine brighter when touched by mindfulness. Science today echoes what the Buddha taught 500 years ago. Studies show that mindfulness reduces stress, strengthens focus, even reshapes the brain. But beyond the science lies something deeper. The discovery that peace is not something you pursue, it is something you uncover. Because the truth is, suffering doesn't come from life itself. It comes from the stories we layer on top of it. The pain of losing a job is real, but the endless narrative, "I'm a failure, I'll never recover, my life is ruined," that is the added weight. Mindfulness cuts through the story, allowing us to face the reality without drowning in it. It's like standing in the rain. Without mindfulness, we curse the storm, complain about the wetness, and dream of the sun. With mindfulness, we simply feel the drops on our skin. The rain is still there, but suffering is not. The Buddha called this seeing things as they are. Not better, not worse, not coated in hope or fear, just as they are. And when we see clearly, craving loses its grip. The wheel slows, the chase softens. Mindfulness, then, is not just a practice. It is a key that unlocks the prison of constant wanting. A key that opens the door to freedom. Because when the mind is clear, we no longer mistake shadows for substance. We no longer run after mirages. Instead, we begin to recognize the treasure already here, the quiet joy of simply being alive. And it is this clarity, this way of seeing, that leads us into the heart of the next step, understanding what happiness truly means, when it is no longer chained to desire. When the mind begins to see clearly, something remarkable happens. The chase slows, the noise softens, and what remains is not emptiness, but a quiet sense of fullness. A fullness that doesn't come from acquiring, but from appreciating. This is the secret of gratitude and contentment, the hidden wealth most people overlook. Picture a man who inherits a mountain of gold. He counts it every day, but his eyes are always on the horizon, longing for more. Beside him lives a farmer with little land, just enough rice to feed his family. Each evening, the farmer bows his head before a simple meal, grateful for the harvest, grateful for the laughter of his children. Now ask yourself, who is truly rich? The Buddha once said, "Contentment is the greatest wealth." It is not a poetic metaphor, but a radical truth, because wealth measured by possessions is fragile. It can vanish in a fire, a storm, a single moment of misfortune. But wealth measured by contentment cannot be stolen, cannot be broken, cannot be lost. It is a treasure that grows the more you share it. Think about gratitude for a moment. It is not just saying thank you. It is a way of seeing. a lens that turns ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. A glass of water, when seen with gratitude, becomes a gift of life. A passing smile becomes a blessing. Even the breath in your lungs, unnoticed most of the time, becomes a miracle when viewed through grateful eyes. Modern psychology now confirms what the ancients knew. People who practice gratitude sleep better, stress less, and live longer. Not because life gives them more, but because they notice more. A story is told of two monks walking through the countryside. One complained constantly, "The sun is too hot, the road is too long, my feet ache." The other simply walked in silence, occasionally pausing to admire a flower or to feel the breeze on his face. Finally, the first monk snapped, "Don't you feel the pain? Don't you see how hard this journey is?" The second monk smiled and replied, "Yes, but I also see the beauty. Why should I let the pain blind me to the gift of this moment?" Gratitude is not denial. It doesn't mean ignoring suffering or pretending everything is perfect. It means widening the lens. It means acknowledging the rain, but also noticing the rainbow that follows. It means accepting the thorns, but not missing the rose. And here is where gratitude and contentment meet. Gratitude opens the eyes to blessings. Contentment allows the heart to rest in them. Together, they transform life from a restless pursuit into a sacred dwelling. Without contentment, gratitude can feel fleeting, like a spark that fades in the dark. Without gratitude, contentment risks becoming dull resignation. But when combined, they create a living fire that warms the soul. In the West, we often say, "The grass is greener on the other side." But gratitude teaches us that the grass is greener where we water it. Contentment reminds us that we don't need every field, just enough to rest in peace. The wealthy king who always wants more may never taste peace, while the humble villager who treasures what little he has may sleep with a smile. This is the paradox. The richest life is not the one filled with abundance, but the one free from the hunger for abundance. So, what happens when we cultivate this inner wealth? Life changes, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Food tastes better, relationships deepen, even hardships become teachers rather than enemies. The heart grows softer, lighter, more resilient. Because in the end, happiness is not about having everything we want. It's about wanting everything we have. Gratitude is the seed. Contentment is the soil. Together, they grow the tree of inner wealth, deeply rooted, unshakable, bearing fruit in every season. And from this tree arises a new understanding. That true freedom is not in chasing more, but in cherishing what already is. It is from here that we move closer to the heart of Buddhism's wisdom, where happiness is not bound to possessions or even fleeting emotions, but to a profound sense of enough. When we learn to be grateful, when we begin to rest in contentment, something unexpected arises, the courage to face suffering. For suffering is not the enemy, but a teacher disguised in robes of discomfort. The Buddha's very first teaching after enlightenment was not about bliss, not about paradise, but about suffering, the first noble truth. Not to depress us, but to awaken us, because until we see suffering clearly, we are bound by it. Think of pain as a messenger, a fire alarm. When smoke fills a house, the alarm screams. You don't curse the alarm, you listen, you act. In the same way, suffering calls our attention. Something here needs to be understood. But most of us resist. We drown pain with distractions, bury it under pleasure, or numb it with endless consumption. Yet the more we resist, the louder it becomes. There is a story of a man shot by an arrow. Instead of removing it, he demanded to know, who shot it, from where, what kind of bow was used? He delayed, and the poison spread. The Buddha told this story to show that we often waste time avoiding pain instead of addressing it. The point is not to debate the arrow, it is to remove it. But how do we remove the arrow of suffering? Not by denial, not by running, by seeing differently. Mindfulness teaches us to sit with pain, to breathe into it, to observe without judgment. When a storm rises, we don't fight the clouds, we watch them pass. When sorrow burns, we don't have to add fuel with anger or blame. We can simply say, this is pain. And strangely, by naming it, by meeting it, its grip begins to loosen. Even modern neuroscience shows this. Studies reveal that when we observe pain mindfully, the brain registers less suffering. The pain may still exist, but the suffering, the story we weave around it, diminishes. Imagine a woman who loses her job. One way of seeing, this is the end, I am worthless, life is unfair. Suffering multiplies. Another way of seeing, This is painful, but perhaps it opens a door to something new. Same event, different lens. One path leads to despair, the other to growth. The Buddha compared suffering to two arrows. The first arrow is the inevitable pain of life, aging, illness, loss. The second arrow is the one we shoot ourselves, anger, resistance, self-pity. The first arrow hurts, but the second makes it unbearable. The wise learn to stop firing that second arrow, and here lies the power of transformation. When we see suffering not as punishment, but as teacher, everything shifts. The broken heart becomes a lesson in compassion. The failure becomes a doorway to humility. Even sickness becomes a reminder of the fragility and preciousness of life. There is an old Zen saying, "The obstacle is the path." At first, it sounds cruel, but look closer. Without challenges, how will we grow patience? Without loss, how will we treasure love? Without hardship, how will we ever understand the meaning of joy? Gratitude and contentment soften the heart so that suffering does not harden us. They allow us to see pain differently, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a companion guiding us deeper into wisdom. A monk once sat by a river, watching the current. A branch floated by, snagged on a rock, and shook violently in the current. The monk whispered, "That is suffering, the clinging." Moments later, the branch broke free, carried gently downstream. The monk smiled, "That is release." We too can learn to float, to release our grip on the need for life to be always comfortable, always certain. In that release, suffering does not vanish, but it transforms. It becomes lighter, softer, even meaningful. When suffering softens into wisdom, the heart begins to ask, "What do I truly need?" This question, so simple, has guided sages and seekers for centuries. For while the world shouts at us to acquire more, the Dharma whispers, happiness is not in the clutter of possessions, but in the clarity of vision. Imagine a traveler crossing a desert. At first, he loads his back with food, clothing, tools, trinkets, everything he thinks he might need. But the sun rises, the sand burns, and the weight becomes unbearable. Step by step, he begins to discard, a pot here, a blanket there, until finally, with almost nothing left, he moves swiftly, freely, joyfully. His burden was not the desert, it was what he carried into it. Our lives are deserts filled with excess baggage. The more we accumulate, the heavier the journey feels. Yet simplicity is not deprivation, it is liberation. The Buddha himself embodied this. Born a prince, surrounded by luxury, he walked away from palaces not because he despised life, but because he sought to see it clearly. He showed us that letting go is not losing, it is gaining the ability to breathe, to live, to love without chains. Think of a room cluttered with furniture. You can barely move, every step is cautious. Now imagine that same room cleared, space opens, light enters, you move with ease. Simplicity is like that, removing the unnecessary so that the essential can shine. In our modern world, this lesson feels radical. We are told happiness comes from upgrades, new phones, bigger houses, faster cars. Yet every upgrade demands more energy, more stress, more time. We don't own our possessions, they own us. The more we polish them, the more they polish away our freedom. But those who live simply see more. A monk with a single bowl notices the flavor of rice. A family with modest means treasures the laughter around their table. A child with no toys turns a stick into a sword, a stone into a treasure. When we have less, our senses sharpen. When we are not drowning in excess, life reveals its hidden beauty. This is not to say we must abandon all things and live in caves. Simplicity is not about rejecting the world, but relating to it differently. It is about asking, does this add to my freedom or my chains? There is a story of a king who envied a poor farmer. Each morning, the farmer whistled as he worked, lighthearted and free. The king, surrounded by jewels, could not sleep, haunted by worry. One day he gave the farmer a bag of gold. From that moment, the farmer stopped singing. He worried about thieves, about where to hide it, about how to spend it. The king laughed bitterly, "Now you are like me." We often believe more will bring joy, yet more can also bring fear, anxiety, attachment. To live with less is to unlearn this illusion. Simplicity also nourishes the earth. Every possession we crave takes resources, every indulgence leaves a footprint. To live simply is to live in harmony with nature, to walk lightly on the world instead of trampling it. The great masters remind us, contentment is the greatest wealth. A billionaire who craves more is poor. A villager who smiles at the sunrise is rich beyond measure. True wealth is not measured in gold or goods, but in the freedom of the heart. When we simplify, space opens not just around us, but within us. With fewer distractions, the mind grows quiet. With fewer cravings, the heart grows still. And in that stillness, life appears more vivid than ever. A bird's song, a child's laughter, the silence between breaths. These become treasures. Living with less does not mean less life, it means more life, more awareness, more freedom, more joy in the simple and the ordinary. The desert traveler, once burdened, now walks lightly. He sees the horizon not as a threat, but as a promise. And so can we, if we dare to let go. For in simplicity lies not emptiness, but fullness. Not lack, but abundance. And when we learn to live this way, we prepare the ground for the greatest balance of all, the middle path, where life is not about extremes, but harmony. And so we arrive here, not at the end, but at the threshold of a new way of living. For what began as a restless chase, a hunger for more, has now revealed itself as an illusion. Happiness was never hiding in possessions, in titles, in the approval of others. It was never waiting at the end of a purchase or behind the doors of success. It was here all along, quietly resting within the way we see. The Buddha once said, "We are shaped by our thoughts, we become what we think." If we see the world as lacking, we will always feel poor. If we see it as abundant, gratitude will fill us like sunlight spilling into a dark room. This is the shift. Happiness is not an object to be grasped, it is a perspective to be awakened. Think of the morning sky. One person complains of clouds hiding the sun. Another marvels at the patterns, the changing colors, the mystery of weather itself. Same sky, different eyes. The world outside is the same, but the world inside makes all the difference. When desire was endless, life felt like running on a wheel that never stopped. When mindfulness opened our eyes, we saw that the wheel itself was an illusion. The moment we stepped off, we realized the ground beneath us was already firm, already whole. This is why monks with bowls, farmers with little, sages with silence, all seem so radiant. They have learned to see differently. And in that seeing, they have found what emperors and merchants often miss: peace. We do not need to renounce the world to taste this peace. We simply need to shift how we look. A meal, no matter how simple, can nourish both body and soul if taken with gratitude. A conversation, no matter how brief, can be a treasure if given with presence. Even suffering, when seen as a teacher, becomes a doorway into wisdom. The true source of happiness is not what we hold in our hands, but how we hold life in our heart. So let us pause here and ask ourselves, how do I want to see? Do I want to see the world as a battlefield or as a garden? Do I want to see others as threats or as companions on the same fragile journey? Do I want to see life as a problem to fix or as a miracle to witness? Each answer shapes the life we live. Each perception plants the seeds of joy or sorrow. The gift of Buddhism, of mindfulness, of this entire journey is that vision can change. The restless mind can be stilled. The hungry heart can be filled, not by adding, but by seeing clearly. And when we do, we discover something radical, that happiness was never far away. It was woven into each breath, each step, each moment we forgot to notice. This is the invitation, not to chase more, but to awaken more, not to run, but to see. So as this journey closes, let it not be an ending, but a beginning. May we walk lighter, needing less. May we look deeper, seeing more. May we discover, in the simplest of moments, the boundless joy of simply being alive. Happiness does not come from what we have. It comes from how we see. And if we can see with wisdom, gratitude, and compassion, then every day, every breath, every heartbeat becomes enough. And perhaps that is the truest happiness of all.